The warm summer evening in downtown Silver Creek was shattered by the sound of screeching tires and breaking glass. Brandon Matthews, the 24-year-old son of billionaire tech mogul Richard Matthews, sat behind the wheel of his bright red Ferrari, staring at the destruction he had just caused. The front of his $300,000 car was now buried deep inside the front wall of Golden Dragon, a small family-owned Chinese restaurant. The strong smell of burnt rubber mixed with the sweet and sour aromas coming from the kitchen. People on the street stopped and stared, phones raised to record the scene. Brandon stumbled out of his car, his designer suit wrinkled and his eyes glazed over from too many drinks at the exclusive rooftop bar he had just left. Inside the restaurant, 68-year-old Mr. Chen and his wife watched in horror as dust settled around their broken dreams. The restaurant they had built from nothing over 30 years lay in ruins. Tables were overturned, plates were shattered, and the beautiful dragon mural Mrs. Chen had painted herself was now cracked and ruined. "Oh my God, my car!" Brandon shouted, completely ignoring the destruction around him. He pulled out his phone, nearly dropping it twice before managing to dial. "Dad! Dad, I need help. There's been a tiny accident." Mr. Chen slowly approached Brandon, his hands shaking. "Young man, you could have killed someone. There were families eating here just minutes ago." Brandon looked at the old man with annoyance. He waved his hand dismissively and turned away, continuing his phone conversation. "Dad, there's this weird old guy yelling at me. Can you send the lawyers? And I need a new car. The Ferrari's totally ruined." Mrs. Chen put her arm around her husband, tears streaming down her face as she looked at their ruined kitchen. The kitchen where she had taught her daughter to make their secret family recipes, where they had celebrated countless birthdays and welcomed regular customers who had become like family. Two police officers arrived at the scene. Officer Sarah Rodriguez immediately noticed the strong smell of alcohol on Brandon's breath. "Sir, I need you to take a breathalyzer test." Brandon laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Do you know who my father is, Richard Matthews? The guy who basically owns half this city. Trust me, you don't want to do this." The second officer, Tom Wilson, stepped forward with the breathalyzer. "Sir, your name doesn't matter right now. The law is the law." Brandon rolled his eyes but took the test. The machine beeped. His blood alcohol level was more than twice the legal limit. But instead of showing concern, he just smirked and made another call. "Hey, Kevin? Yeah, it's Brandon Matthews. Dad said you'd be my lawyer for this little thing. These cops are trying to give me trouble." He looked at the officers with a smug smile. "My lawyer says I don't have to talk to you anymore." As if on cue, 3 expensive black SUVs pulled up to the scene. Men in expensive suits stepped out, carrying briefcases and looking important. Leading them was Richard Matthews himself, his face red with anger, not at his son, but at the inconvenience of having to deal with this situation. Mr. Chen watched as the lawyers surrounded Brandon like a protective wall. His wife squeezed his hand, both of them knowing what usually happened when rich people got into trouble. They had seen it before, money talking, justice walking. But what nobody at the scene knew was that this case would end up in front of Judge Sarah Martinez. And Judge Martinez had a very different view of justice than what Brandon Matthews and his father were used to. As Brandon was escorted to a police car, he was still smiling, still making jokes on his phone about getting the cheap restaurant shut down and building something classier in its place. He had no idea that in just a few days, one simple word from Judge Martinez would wipe that smile off his face and change his life forever. The Chens stood in their broken doorway, watching the circus of lawyers, police, and onlookers. 30 years of hard work lay in pieces around them, but they held each other tightly, praying that somehow, this time, justice would prevail over money. 3 days after the crash, the courthouse buzzed with activity. Brandon Matthews strutted through the metal detectors wearing a $5,000 suit and sporting designer sunglasses. Behind him walked 5 expensive lawyers, each carrying leather briefcases and wearing serious expressions. The young man hadn't spent a single minute in jail, thanks to his father's connections. Mr. and Mrs. Chen sat quietly on a wooden bench outside the courtroom. They looked small and tired in their best but simple clothes. Their daughter Jenny, who had flown in from college, sat between them, holding their hands. They had no fancy lawyer, just a young public defender named Mike Torres who believed in justice more than money. "Don't worry about these people," Brandon said loudly as he passed the Chen family, not even bothering to lower his voice. They'll be happy with whatever money we throw at them. These types always are. Jenny Chen stood up, her face red with anger, but her father gently pulled her back down. Patience, he whispered. Good people win in the end. Inside the courtroom, Judge Sarah Martinez prepared to start her day. At 45, she had earned a reputation for being tough but fair. She looked at the case file on her desk and frowned. She had seen the name Matthews too many times before, always getting away with breaking the law because of their money and connections. The bailiff called everyone to stand as Judge Martinez entered. Brandon barely looked up from his phone. One of his lawyers had to nudge him to stand. First case, State versus Brandon Matthews, the bailiff announced. Before Judge Martinez could speak, the doors burst open. Richard Matthews walked in like he owned the place. He was a tall man with gray hair and cold eyes, wearing a suit that cost more than most people made in a year. He nodded to his son and took a seat right behind the defense table. Your Honor, Brandon's lead lawyer started, we're prepared to offer a generous settlement to avoid wasting the court's valuable time. The Matthews family will pay for all damages and... Judge Martinez held up her hand. Mr. Peterson, we're here for the arraignment. Your client needs to enter a plea first. Richard Matthews stood up without being called. Judge Martinez, may I have a word in private? I believe we can resolve this efficiently. The judge's eyes narrowed. Mr. Matthews, please be seated. This is a courtroom, not your boardroom. Richard didn't sit. Instead, he walked closer to the bench. Judge, let's be realistic. I'm on the board of the State Bar Association. I golf with the Chief Justice. One phone call from me. Dad, watch this, Brandon interrupted with a laugh. These people are about to learn how things really work in this city. The Chen family watched in silence. They had seen this before, rich people using their money and power to escape justice. Mrs. Chen wiped away a tear, thinking about their ruined restaurant. Judge Martinez's face remained calm, but her eyes flashed with anger. She had grown up in a poor neighborhood, watching rich people get away with crimes while her neighbors went to jail for much less. She had worked too hard and come too far to let money mock justice in her courtroom. Richard Matthews continued, his voice getting louder. Judge, do you really want to risk your career over something so trivial? One word from me to the right people, and you'll be handling parking tickets in small claims court. The courtroom fell silent. Everyone waited to see what would happen. Brandon smirked, already planning which club he would visit that night. His father stood confidently, used to getting his way. The lawyers shuffled their expensive papers, preparing to wrap up another easy win. Judge Martinez looked straight at Richard Matthews. Her voice was quiet but clear as she said just one word. Contempt. The smirk froze on Brandon's face. For the first time in his life, he was about to learn that some things couldn't be fixed with Daddy's money. The word contempt echoed through the silent courtroom. Two court officers immediately moved towards Richard Matthews, who stood frozen in disbelief. Nobody had ever dared to challenge him like this before. You can't be serious, Richard sputtered, his face turning red. Do you know who I am? Judge Martinez's voice remained steady. In this courtroom, Mr. Matthews, you are simply a citizen who has just earned himself 3 days in county jail for contempt of court. Officers, please escort him out. Brandon jumped up from his chair. You can't do this to my father. This is crazy. His expensive lawyers quickly pulled him back down, trying to prevent him from making the situation worse. As the officers led Richard Matthews away in handcuffs, Judge Martinez turned to her clerk. Please bring me the Chen family's file. She wanted to review their business history while the courtroom settled down. The file told a story that felt familiar to her. 20 years ago, the same Richard Matthews had tried to buy the Chen's property to build a shopping mall. When they refused to sell their restaurant, mysterious health code violations started appearing. The Chens had fought back then, just as they were doing now. Judge Martinez remembered those days well. As a young law student, she had worked as a waitress at Golden Dragon to help pay for her education. Every morning at 5 a.m., before her classes, she would see Mr. Chen preparing fresh dough for dumplings. Mrs. Chen would always insist on feeding her, saying she was too thin. Your Honor, Brandon's lead lawyer spoke up, breaking into her thoughts. Perhaps we should continue this another day, given the unusual circumstances. The judge looked at Brandon, who was now slumped in his chair, his earlier confidence shattered. No, Mr. Peterson, this hearing will continue. Your client still needs to enter a plea. Jenny Chen squeezed her parents' hands as they watched. For the first time since the accident, they felt a small spark of hope. They remembered Judge Martinez from her waitressing days, but had never mentioned it out of respect for her position. Mr. Matthews, Judge Martinez addressed Brandon directly. Before you enter your plea, I want to tell you a story about a young woman who once worked 3 jobs to put herself through law school. Brandon looked up, confused by this unexpected turn. This woman watched her own father lose his small business to a wealthy man who thought money could buy anything. She promised herself that if she ever had the power to protect others from such injustice, she would use it. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even Brandon's lawyers had stopped shuffling their papers. That woman spent 15 years building a reputation for being fair and incorruptible. She turned down bribes, refused dinner invitations from powerful people, and worked twice as hard as everyone else. Because she knew that one day, someone like you would walk into her courtroom, expecting money to speak louder than justice. Mrs. Chen wiped away tears as she listened. She remembered the young Sarah Martinez, always studying at the corner table between serving customers, determined to make something of herself. Your father's threats mean nothing to me, Mr. Matthews, because I've spent my entire career preparing for people like him. Now, would you like to enter your plea, or would you prefer to join your father in contempt? Brandon swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, he felt truly scared. His father was in jail, his expensive lawyers looked helpless, and this judge, this woman who had once served dumplings to pay for law school, held his fate in her hands. How? How do you plead, Mr. Matthews? The judge asked again, her voice firm but not unkind. Brandon looked around the courtroom. He saw the Chen family watching him. He saw his useless lawyers. He saw the empty space where his father should have been, and for the first time in his privileged life, he realized that he was completely alone with the consequences of his actions. Brandon's mouth felt dry as he stood in the courtroom. His expensive silk tie suddenly felt too tight around his neck. Everyone was waiting for his answer. Guilty, he finally whispered, the word feeling strange on his tongue. He had never admitted to being wrong about anything before. Speak up, Mr. Matthews, Judge Martinez ordered. The court needs to hear your plea clearly. Guilty, Your Honor, Brandon said louder this time, his voice shaking. One of his lawyers immediately tried to stop him, but Brandon pushed his hand away. I'm guilty of driving drunk and destroying the Chen family's restaurant. The judge nodded, making notes in her file. Given the severity of the offense and your family's considerable resources, including private jets and homes in multiple countries, I consider you a flight risk. Bailiff, please take Mr. Matthews into custody until his sentencing hearing next week. Brandon's lawyers erupted in protest, but Judge Martinez silenced them with a stern look. Unless you'd like to join Mr. Matthews Sr. in the contempt cell, I suggest you all sit down. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Brandon's legs began to shake. He had never been handcuffed before. The cold metal clicked around his wrists, and suddenly everything felt very real. The walk to the holding cell was the longest journey of Brandon's life. Each step took him further from his world of privilege and deeper into a reality he had never known. The cell door clanged shut behind him, and for the first time, he couldn't just call his father to fix things. In the cell next door, a man named Jose watched Brandon pace back and forth. Jose had been arrested for stealing food to feed his family after losing his job. He noticed Brandon's expensive suit and designer shoes. First time in the system? Jose asked quietly. Brandon stopped pacing and looked at his neighbor. Under normal circumstances, you wouldn't even acknowledge someone like Jose, but these weren't normal circumstances. Yeah, Brandon replied, his voice barely a whisper. I messed up bad, really bad. Want to talk about it? Jose offered. We got nothing but time in here. Brandon sank down onto the hard bench, his suit getting wrinkled. For the next hour, he found himself telling Jose everything, about the drinking, the crash, his father's attempt to bully the judge, and how it had all backfired. Man, you're lucky nobody got killed, Jose said when Brandon finished. My sister wasn't so fortunate. A drunk driver took her away from us 3 years ago. Brandon felt his stomach twist. He had never thought about how his actions could have killed someone. The Chen family had been closing up when he crashed. Just a few minutes earlier, and the restaurant would have been full of people. That night, Brandon couldn't sleep on the thin jail mattress. He kept thinking about the Chen family, about Jose's sister, about Judge Martinez working as a waitress to become a judge. His father had always taught him that money made them better than other people. But here in this cell, he didn't feel better than anyone. The next morning, Brandon asked to speak with his lawyer, but instead of planning an appeal or a legal strategy, he had a different request. "I want to write a letter," he said, "to the Chen family. I need to apologize, really apologize, not just because my lawyers told me to." His lawyer stared at him in surprise. This wasn't the same arrogant young man from yesterday. In her chambers, Judge Martinez reviewed Brandon's file again. She had taken no pleasure in sending him to jail, but she hoped it would teach him something his father never had: that actions have consequences, no matter how rich you are. What she didn't know was that her one word of contempt had already started changing Brandon Matthews from the spoiled son of a millionaire into something he had never been before: a responsible human being. Brandon spent his second night in the holding cell staring at the ceiling. The sounds were different here: metal doors clanging, distant voices echoing, and sometimes crying. His expensive watch had been taken away, making time feel endless. During breakfast, which consisted of bland oatmeal instead of his usual gourmet meal, Jose introduced him to other inmates. There was Miguel, who had been caught driving with an expired license while taking his sick daughter to the hospital. Then there was Tom, an elderly man who couldn't afford to pay his parking tickets. "You know what's funny?" Tom said, stirring his oatmeal slowly. "I worked as a janitor at your father's company for 20 years. Got laid off last year when they decided to hire a cheaper cleaning service. No pension, no thank you, nothing." Brandon felt his face grow hot with shame. He remembered laughing with his friends about how his father had cleaned house to save money. He had never thought about the real people who lost their jobs. Later that morning, a guard brought Brandon a newspaper. On the front page was a picture of the destroyed Golden Dragon restaurant. The article included an interview with the Chen family. "We came to America 30 years ago with nothing but hope," Mr. Chen had said. "Every day, we worked 16 hours to build our dream. My wife and I missed our daughter's school plays, her piano recitals, because we were always working. But we were proud because we were building something for her future." Brandon read these words over and over. He thought about his own life, the private schools, the expensive cars, the endless parties. He had never built anything. He had only taken and destroyed. During exercise time in the small jail yard, Brandon met David, a man who spent his weekends visiting schools to talk about drunk driving. David showed Brandon a worn photograph of a smiling teenage girl. "This was my daughter Sarah," David said quietly. "She was walking home from the library when a drunk driver hit her. He was a lot like you, rich kid, fancy car, thought he was invincible. The difference is, he killed someone." Brandon felt sick to his stomach. He handed the photo back with trembling hands. "I'm sorry about your daughter," he whispered. "Being sorry isn't enough," David replied firmly. "You need to change. You got lucky. Nobody died when you crashed. But next time, you might not be so fortunate." That afternoon, Brandon asked for paper and a pen. He spent hours writing and rewriting his letter to the Chen family. Words that had once come easily to him, excuses, jokes, clever remarks, now felt hollow and wrong. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Chen," he wrote, "I've spent 2 days in jail thinking about what I did to your restaurant. But I'm starting to understand that I didn't just destroy a building. I destroyed 30 years of your hard work, your dreams, and your sacrifices." In her office, Judge Martinez received a report about Brandon's behavior in jail. She read about his conversations with other inmates, his quiet demeanor, and his request for writing materials. It was a far cry from the arrogant young man who had strutted into her courtroom. Meanwhile, Richard Matthews sat in his own cell, still making threats and demands. Father and son were just yards apart, but they were on very different journeys. That evening, as Brandon lay on his hard bunk, he thought about something Jose had said. "Life has a way of teaching us lessons. The smart ones learn from them. The stupid ones keep making the same mistakes." For the first time in his life, Brandon Matthews wanted to be one of the smart ones. He wanted to learn, to change, to make things right. But first, he had to face the consequences of his actions. not hide behind his father's money and power. On the morning of his next court appearance, Brandon refused the suit his lawyers brought him. Instead, he wore the same wrinkled clothes he'd been arrested in. His normally perfectly styled hair was messy, and 3 days without his expensive skincare products had left him looking surprisingly ordinary. "Mr. Matthews, are you sure about this?" his lead lawyer asked nervously. "We prepared a statement that could help reduce your sentence. Your father's influence." "No," Brandon interrupted. "No more influence. No more statements written by lawyers. I need to speak for myself." The courtroom was packed when Brandon entered. News of Richard Matthews being jailed for contempt had made headlines, and everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The Chen family sat in their usual spot, and Brandon noticed Jenny Chen was holding a folder full of papers, probably documents showing all the damage he had caused. Richard Matthews was brought in from his cell, still wearing his expensive suit, though it was now wrinkled. He tried to catch Brandon's eye, but his son kept his head down, focused on the letter he had written in jail. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Martinez entered the courtroom. She noticed immediately that something was different about Brandon. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like understanding. "Your Honor," Brandon said, standing before she could speak, "may I address the court?" Judge Martinez studied him carefully before nodding. "You may proceed, Mr. Matthews." Brandon's hands shook as he unfolded his letter. The whole courtroom fell silent, waiting to hear what the millionaire's son would say. "3 days ago, I came into this courtroom thinking I was better than everyone else because of my father's money," Brandon began, his voice trembling. "I thought I could buy my way out of anything. But in jail, I met people who taught me what real strength is." He turned to face the Chen family. "I met a man whose sister was killed by someone like me, someone who thought it was okay to drink and drive. I learned that your restaurant wasn't just a building. It was your American dream. It was 30 years of hard work, of missing your daughter's school plays till you could give her a better future." Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes as Brandon continued. "I also met a janitor who lost his job at my father's company. 20 years of loyalty thrown away to save money. I never thought about the real people behind my father's business decisions. I never thought about real people at all." Brandon's voice cracked, but he kept going. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. What I'm asking for is a chance to make things right, not with money, but with actions. I want to help rebuild what I destroyed. I want to work, really work, for the first time in my life." Richard Matthews stood up angrily. "Brandon, stop this nonsense immediately. We don't apologize, to." "Sit down, Mr. Matthews," Judge Martinez ordered sharply. "Your son is speaking." Brandon took a deep breath and continued. "In jail, I wrote this letter to the Chen family 100 times, trying to find the right words. But there are no right words for destroying someone's life's work. There are only actions. Whatever punishment you give me, Your Honor, I accept it. I just ask for the chance to help fix what I broke." The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Martinez looked at Brandon thoughtfully, then at the Chen family, then back at Brandon. In 3 days, she had watched this privileged young man begin a journey that some people never started in their whole lives, the journey to become a better person. Richard Matthews sat fuming in his seat, watching his son throw away years of carefully taught lessons about power and privilege. But for the first time in his life, Brandon wasn't looking at his father for approval. He was looking at the Chen family, hoping they could see that his words were genuine. Judge Martinez took a few moments to consider everything she had heard. The courtroom remained silent, everyone waiting for her decision. Mr. Chen had his arm around his wife, and their daughter Jenny sat with her hands tightly clasped in her lap. "Mr. Matthews," the judge finally spoke, "I've seen many people stand where you're standing now. Most of them say whatever they think will get them the lightest sentence. But something about your words feels different." She paused, looking through her notes. "However, good intentions don't erase serious crimes. You could have killed someone. The breathalyzer showed you were driving with a blood alcohol level more than twice the legal limit. This cannot go unpunished." Brandon nodded, accepting her words. Behind him, his father shifted angrily in his seat but remained silent, having learned his lesson about interrupting the judge. "Therefore," Judge Martinez continued, "I sentence you to 18 months in county jail, followed by 5 years of probation. You will also complete 1,000 hours of community service, attend mandatory alcohol rehabilitation programs, and your driver's license will be suspended for 3 years. The sentence hit Brandon hard, but he stood straight and nodded. It was more jail time than his lawyers had expected, but less than he knew he deserved. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. However, I'm adding something unusual to your sentence. Mr. and Mrs. Chen, would you please stand? The elderly couple stood, holding hands tightly. The Chen family has agreed to let me add a special condition to your sentence, the judge explained. I understand you have a business degree from an expensive university, Mr. Matthews. Instead of doing regular community service, you will spend those 1,000 hours helping the Chen family rebuild and manage their restaurant. Brandon's eyes widened in surprise. He looked at the Chen family, who gave him small, cautious nods. You will work under Mr. Chen's direct supervision, Judge Martinez continued. You'll learn every aspect of running a small family business, not from expensive textbooks, but from people who built something from nothing. You'll understand the value of hard work, dedication, and integrity. She turned to address the Chen family. If at any time you feel this arrangement isn't working, you can request to have Mr. Matthews assigned to regular community service instead. The choice will always be yours. Mrs. Chen stepped forward slightly. Your Honor, may I speak? The judge nodded, and Mrs. Chen turned to face Brandon. Young man, 30 years ago, when we came to this country, many people looked down on us. They thought we were nothing because we couldn't speak English well, because we worked such long hours, because we were different. But we never gave up. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. We believe everyone deserves a second chance. If you are truly sorry, if you really want to change, we will teach you everything we know about running a restaurant, about working hard, about treating people with respect. Brandon felt tears running down his face, but for once in his life, he didn't try to hide them. Thank you, he whispered. I won't let you down. Judge Martinez picked up her gavel. Mr. Matthews, you will begin your jail sentence today. When you're released, you will start to work with the Chen family. This is your chance to prove that your words today were genuine. She looked at Brandon's father, and Mr. Matthews Sr., you will complete your 3 days for contempt of court. Perhaps you too could learn something from the Chen family about real values and dignity. With that, she brought down her gavel. As the bailiff approached to take Brandon away, he turned one last time to the Chen family. I promise, he said firmly, when I come back, I'll be someone worthy of your trust. For the first time since the accident, Mr. Chen smiled slightly. Sometimes, he thought, good things could come from even the worst situations. Maybe this young man really could change. Maybe his wife was right. Everyone deserved a second chance. 1 year later, the Golden Dragon restaurant looked very different. The broken walls had been replaced with beautiful new stonework. Large windows let in plenty of natural light, and a stunning new dragon mural, painted by Mrs. Chen and Jenny together, wrapped around the dining room. But the biggest change wasn't in the building, it was in the people inside it. Brandon Matthews, dressed in simple black pants and a clean white shirt, moved quickly between tables during the lunch rush. Gone was the designer clothing and expensive watch. His hands, once soft from a life of luxury, now showed small burns from kitchen work and calluses from carrying heavy supplies. Table 5 needs more water, he called out to one of the servers as he carried a steaming plate of dumplings to another customer. And remember, Mr. Wu likes extra chili sauce with his noodles. In the kitchen, Mr. Chen watched with pride as Brandon expertly folded dumplings beside him. Your technique is getting better, the older man said with a smile. Soon you'll be as fast as my wife. Mrs. Chen laughed from her cooking station. Nobody is as fast as me. But yes, Brandon has learned well. She paused to taste the sauce Brandon had made. Perfect balance of flavors. You remembered the secret ingredient. The restaurant was busier than ever. Brandon had used his business education, but in a way his expensive professors never taught. He had helped the Chen set up a website and social media presence, modernized their ordering system, and created a loyalty program for regular customers. But more importantly, he had learned every recipe, every technique, and every tradition the family had to teach. During quiet moments between lunch and dinner service, Brandon would sit with Mr. Chen, learning about Chinese culture and history. Sometimes they would look at old family photos, and Mr. Chen would share stories about his journey to America. These quiet conversations taught Brandon more about success than all his father's lectures about power and money ever had. Richard Matthews had changed too, though not as dramatically as his son. After completing his contempt sentence, he had been shocked to find that some business partners were starting to avoid him. His reputation for bullying and throwing money around wasn't working anymore. Watching his son work hard and earn genuine respect made him question his own ways of doing things. One day, Richard visited the restaurant during off hours. He sat at a corner table, watching Brandon work. His son moved differently now, with purpose and humility instead of arrogance. When Brandon served him a cup of tea, Richard hardly recognized the young man standing before him. "The Chens are teaching me about tea ceremonies today," Brandon said quietly. "Did you know each movement has a meaning? It's about respect, patience, and being present in the moment." Richard looked down at his cup. "I never took the time to learn things like that," he admitted. "I was too busy making money." Brandon smiled slightly. "It's never too late to learn, Dad. Mr. Chen always says that." That evening, after the restaurant closed, the Chen family and Brandon sat down for their traditional family meal. Jenny, home from graduate school, was teaching Brandon how to use chopsticks properly. There was laughter, warm food, and conversation in a mix of English and Chinese that Brandon was slowly learning to understand. Outside the restaurant window, a young woman walking past stopped to look at the "Help Wanted" sign. She had just lost her job and was worried about paying for college. Through the window, she saw the happy group sharing food and stories. Little did she know that tomorrow, when she came in to apply for the job, she would meet a very different Brandon Matthews than the one who had crashed into this restaurant a year ago. She would learn, just as he had, that sometimes the biggest changes in life come from unexpected places. And somewhere in her courthouse office, Judge Martinez smiled as she read the latest progress report about Brandon Matthews. Her one word of contempt had started a chain reaction that changed not just one privileged young man, but an entire community. Sometimes, she thought, justice worked in mysterious ways.